Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to today's event, A Post-Syria Era, the Future of Russia's Mediterranean Engagement. My name is Chiara Lovotti, and I'm an Associate Research Fellow here at ISPI. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our panelists, and a special thank you to our partner, the Malcolm H. Kerr Middle East Center in Beirut, Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, that co-organized this event with ISPI. Thank you especially to you, Mohanad Hage for your cooperation. Mohanad is the Deputy Director of the Center, and also thank you to Maha Yahya, the Director of the Center for this partnership. This event is hosted in the broader framework of the Rome-Med Mediterranean Dialogues, which is the conference co-promoted by ISPI and the Italian Ministry for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. And this year's edition of the Med Dialogues will take place in Naples from 15 to 17 October. So please save the dates in your calendars. So this is a brief session to discuss the future of Russia's presence in the Mediterranean area after the setbacks that Russia has suffered in Syria a few months ago at the end of last year, 2024. As you know, over the past decade, Syria has really been the cornerstone of Russia's return to the Mediterranean. Moscow's military intervention that was launched in 2015 not only saved the Assad regime, not only it maintained the Assad regime in power, but it also signaled a broader ambition of Russia to reassert Moscow's influence in a region of strategic importance for the country's foreign policy and foreign projection. And of course, I say reassert because Russia clearly is not new to Syria. It is not new to the Middle East and North Africa region in general. The Soviet Union had been a key ally for these countries and used to enjoy quite a heavy presence in many domains of these countries' lives, their economies, their military apparatuses, and even their politics. But Russia considerably lost that influence with the collapse of the Soviet state. So I was saying, since Russia's return to the Middle East more or less a decade ago, Syria has been the strategic Russian asset in the region. It has been the launching pad of Russia's many other activities across the Middle East and North Africa. But as the situation in Syria shifted dramatically in December last year, we are now asking our speakers, is Russia entering a new phase of its engagement with the Arab country and more generally with countries of the Middle East and North Africa, with a new power dynamic emerging in Syria? Is Moscow recalibrating its ambitions, or is it changing them completely? Is it doubling down on other, maybe more successful partnerships while letting Syria go? How is Russia's Mediterranean strategy evolving in a nutshell? Especially if we also consider Russia's draining war in Ukraine, its mounting economic constraints, and of course, also on the other side, a volatile regional landscape in the Middle East, from Gaza to Lebanon to Libya and the Red Sea. So today's conversation really invites us to look beyond Syria without, of course, losing sight of how the legacy of that Russian intervention continues to shape Russia's presence in the Mediterranean. And with that, I'll hand it over to our panel, and I really look forward to a rich discussion with our speakers, which I'm happy to introduce. Mohanad Hage, whom I already mentioned, is the Deputy Director for Research at Carnegie Middle East Center. Anna Borshchevskaya is the Senior Fellow at the Diane and Guilford Glaser Foundation Program on Great Power Competition and the Middle East. That's a long title. Anna of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And Anas Gomati is the founder and director of the Sadeq Institute. Thank you all for being here and accepting our invitation. I will ask the first question to Anna, if you allow me, Anna. And for each answers, I kindly ask you to stay within five minutes time. And as I said, over the last decade, Syria has really been the cornerstone of Russia's military projection in the Mediterranean area. But since the fall of the Assad regime, the country is navigating a very different, a very altered, a very much changed Syrian local landscape. One, of course, in which its key ally, Assad, is gone, and a new leadership, a very different leadership from the previous one, has taken power, and rival powers within the country are asserting themselves. How would you characterize Russia's role in Syria today? How has Moscow also recalibrated its military and strategic presence in the country? Do you think we are witnessing a scaling down or a reconfiguration or a shift in priorities of Russian strategies? Please, Anna, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and I look forward to a great discussion. Let me start answering your question by first framing what were Russia's interests in Syria and what they are now, because I think that'll help better understand what Russia is trying to accomplish today. First and foremost, for Russia, Syria was never about Assad in particular, and it was never even about Syria. It was always about a bigger geostrategic battle with the United States. Russia is trying to reframe the US-led global order. Russia is resentful of the US-led global order and wants to replace it with a multipolar, what the Russians actually call polycentric world. So for Russia, Syria, again, it was never about Assad or even about Syria. It was really about the United States. It was about competition with the United States and about positioning Russia in Syria in a way that would allow it to better compete with the United States. And in order to do that, Russia needed a regime in Damascus that would ensure its interests. But for all practical purposes, for many years, certainly for well over a decade, Russia simply did not see a better alternative to Assad. So that's why in the early years, after Russia's intervention, if many of you recall, Russia would often play this double game where they would say, well, we're not so much wedded to Assad, we're wedded to a quote unquote legitimate government in Damascus. That was halfway true. In practice, they really were wedded to Assad, but not because they were friends till the end. And that leads me to the second point, and that really brings us more to the present. And what is Russia doing in Syria now? What are its interests? With everyone's focus on Assad's fall, I'd like to highlight something very important. Russia is still in Syria. They're certainly down, but they're not out. And I think that is very important to understand going forward and what is Russia trying to accomplish. Certainly Russia had to scale back its presence, as you've mentioned, Chiara, earlier in your remarks, but they still have a presence in Syria. And I'm sure we'll get into some of the details of what that presence looks like. Of course, that's Russia's military bases, but I would look for, again, a slightly broader framework for what Russia is trying to do. Russia's military bases are important, but there's lots of other aspects to what Russia is doing there. And what I am seeing is that Syria simply no longer paid the dividends that it did for the Russian state as it had been in the previous years. Assad was certainly not an easy partner even for the Russians. But what Russia wants is a presence in Syria on the Eastern Mediterranean. That is a historic Russian aspiration. Frankly, it predates even the Soviet Union. Imperial Russia wanted this presence. Certainly that is an interest that will outlive even Vladimir Putin. And the important thing to remember for this discussion is that Russia is still in Syria. It is still asserting its interests in a different way, in a much more scaled back way than it was before. And of course, as you mentioned, Ukraine is an important aspect, part of the answer as to why Russia essentially lost this round. But what I want to end with is by saying that certainly this is, again, a defeat of sorts in Russia. Turkey has outmaneuvered Russia in Syria for the time being, but it's not the grand geostrategic global loss for Russia that many have painted it to be. It's a little bit, it's a much more scaled back situation because Russia is still in Syria.
Thank you, Anna. Very interesting, and I like what you said, because you don't hear it very often, that Syria was never, for the Russian, Syria was never about Assad himself. Of course, by himself meaning the regime. But this helps me to go to the next question, to Mohanad, actually. True, I agree with you, Anna, but it's also true that on the other side, the Assad regime, although maybe it wasn't the main priority for the Russians, but it is true that he left the door open for the Russians for a long, long time. Now that the situation has changed, Mohanad, how would you assess Moscow's current leverage over the current Syrian leadership and the country's broader internal dynamics? Is Russia or will Russia still be able to shape political security processes or to shape processes in general as much as it was before, provided that it was, or is it increasingly or will be increasingly sidelined by other actors? And Anna was mentioning Turkey, of course, for instance. Over to you, Mohanad. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for ISPI for their efforts in putting this together. The main approach that the Russians are taking in Syria at the moment is transactional, really transactional. So, and the first order for them is to preserve the bases, the air base in Hamimim in the Latakia region, and the naval base that they have in Tartus. Of course, they would like to secure a long-term deal, perhaps preserving what they've signed with Assad. The long term, not time restricted deal when it comes to Hamimim and the 49-year agreement on the Tartus base, naval base, which was a generous deal done with the Assad regime, given the lack of balance between both sides. The new Syrian regime wants to renegotiate these agreements and find better terms. And also they've attached this issue to other demands that they've put on the table, across the table from Russia. One of them, of course, is that they ask compensation from Russia regarding their participation in the Syrian conflict and the damages that they caused during their involvement in the Syrian conflict. And then they would like to extradite Bashar al-Assad, a very difficult one, I think, for the Russian side. And also the confiscation and return of funds which were moved or transferred from Syria by the former regime officials in Damascus to Moscow. And that's also another difficult demand put forward. But what we're seeing now, while this has stalled and we haven't seen any movement there, what we're seeing is a transactional approach in which Russia is delivering what the Syrian side needs: oil, diesel, and gas. They're using tankers which are already under US sanctions, which makes it easier for Russia to navigate these waters. We've seen deliveries on as fast as January, so weeks after the fall of the regime, we saw Russia take on that role, and I think that kind of helped in securing and keeping the bases there. And also, I think, given the geopolitical shifts, we're talking about Turkish-Israeli tensions. I think Russia is aiming to play a mediating role, very similar to the one that it played with Iran on one hand, and Israel on the other hand, in the sense that they were managing the tensions. Of course, to have a different set of players to navigate. Israel cannot deal with the Turkish presence in Syria the way it dealt with the Iranian presence in Syria. This is not feasible given the balance of powers in the Turkish military's capabilities, but also vis-a-vis the US. I mean, the US and Turkey enjoy their own set of relations. We're seeing the US trying to mediate as well between Israel and Turkey. And I think Russia can play such a complementary role alongside the Trump administration. So the mediating role that Russia played inside Syria could be continued in different forms. And this is, we are in a formative period, and I think they're trying to test the waters there. But going back to the Ukraine conflict, which I think, downscaled or downsized the Russian involvement in Syria once it happened, once the Ukraine invasion became the central focus. But if there's a grand US deal or mediation leading to an end of the conflict of Ukraine, the question is, will we see a replication of the post-first Ukraine war involvement in the Levant? Because after the first Ukraine involvement in 2014 ended, we saw the Russian intervention in 2015, and the Russian intervention in 2015 was not only about Syria; it was about how Putin sees his state playing an expansive role across the region. It was about reviving Russian imperial role and Russian imperial symbols and institutions in the region. So it was quite an ambitious drive across the Levant. And I see perhaps prospects a decade later now, if there's an end to the war in Ukraine, if we see that bus coming towards us, I think we have to start wondering about what comes next in the Middle East. There might be a Russian ambition of, reviving their role, or perhaps playing, above their current weight in the region. So I think that's a question of what comes next and a follow-up to the Ukraine conflict.
Thank you, Mohanad. Very good point. Anas, I'll come to you now. So with Syria no longer central, or no longer as central as it was before, to Russia's regional presence posture, is Moscow now redirecting some of its strategic attention towards other countries, such as, for instance, Libya, or other theaters, such as the Sahel, where perhaps it would perceives more opportunity and less competition, less difficulties? Do you see signs that Russia is reallocating indeed resources towards North Africa or the Sahel as part of its broader strategy, or not? Please, Anas, over to you.
Thanks, Chiara. I just want to thank yourself and Mohanad and ISPI and Carnegie also for hosting us this afternoon. I think it's a really great question. I think I would only say that, is it now thinking of redirecting? Is it now thinking of Libya in these terms? I mean, yes, if we think in terms of Western attention, the world has been obsessed with Ukraine and with Gaza, rightfully so, over the last 18 months in particular, in the last 2-3 years. But when we're thinking of how Russia has been looking at Libya, its presence there has been there since 2019. So we're in a 6th year of this. And I think it's important because whilst the world, or particularly the West's attention, is on Russia's front door in Ukraine, it's been getting into Africa through the back window in Libya. And it has been doing that now for about 6 years. And as you rightly pointed out, that isn't just Libya, that's further through to the Sahel. So I think it's, we have to start somewhere, right? And we could start around the redeployment of assets after the fall of Assad. I think some people thought of it as a withdrawal. It's more, for me, a strategic redeployment. And so what we're witnessing is not really just kind of reactive, and it's not improv. It's a calculated adaptation to what they believe is a higher stake strategy, but with a higher return. And I mean, as you said earlier on, right, the evidence is right there in plain writing. So I think around January, we documented at least 11 Ilyushins and AN-124s with these big distinctive nose cones that are opened up, right? So we saw those flights moving into Tobruk and the port of Tobruk in eastern Libya. And I think we've also seen something new since then. We've seen the renovation of a new base, or a base that is not new in Libya, but new for Russia, Matanasara in the south of Libya. But what's interesting about that deployment is that they already have in the east Al-Khadam and Tobruk near the port of Bomba. They have Gardabiya in Sirt, and they have further south Jufra and Brakashati. So they already have a number of bases that they can work with. But Matanasara, if you look at the satellite imagery, they're constructing a massive military logistics network there. They're not just patching up an old runway. There's new logistics hubs with new housing. There's a massive new runway, as I already said. Storage facilities, control towers. This looks like a nerve center, not just like a halfway house for a couple of mercenaries. And on the point of mercenaries as well, we've obviously seen a shift in Libya over the last 2 years since the fall of Prigozhin. We've seen the Africa Corps emerge in the wake of his death. Now, for me, this is a strategic upgrade, because they're not just working through deniability, which they had in the past. These guys are now embedding themselves within institutions, notably in Libya, but also in Mali and Kerr. Sudan obviously is a more complex situation. But what I would say is that, everyone was taken off guard. I mean, I, myself included, was taken off guard with what happened in Syria. And I think we're often thinking in terms of what the lessons were learned, by Russia. And I think they've learned that you can't necessarily, and I agree with Anna and Mohanad, but I would just talk about the relationship that they had with Assad. You can't necessarily rely upon propping up and having one relationship with, as you said, I think, a legitimate regime in Damascus. They're not working with a legitimate regime in eastern Libya. They're working with a warlord. They're also working with a warlord who has an American passport. What they're doing is quite unusual, but in a very subtle sense, they've realized that this, and I think it was Anna that mentioned this about their position, it's not a centralized position anymore. It's network centric. They have a network that will outlive whatever happens in a very politically volatile Mediterranean region, and certainly one in Africa. And I think anecdotally, I've heard this in the continent, when I'm in East Africa and West Africa, particularly in West Africa and the Sahel, and I speak to people that are doing business with Russians. They say, well, the West, when we talk about weapons and we talk about upgrading our security, they lecture us. They lecture us about human rights, they lecture us about democracy, and then they talk about congressional hearings and congressional grandstanding that will take months, if not years, for them to even see an arms deal. With Russia, they don't need years, they need weeks. And it's that agility, that speed, that silence that is also a competitive, strategic advantage that Russia has when it's building these relationships there. The second point, I think, also is it's not just this redeployment on the chessboard. I mean, you could say that they've moved their queen from Hamimim to Tobruk, but I think what they've realized also is the strategic architecture in Africa and in the Mediterranean poses a massive challenge to Europeans, because they not only control the bases on the ground, they control those corridors on the ground, and they control the air, right? This is not NATO territory when you're moving into Libya and into North Africa. So there is really a competitive advantage that they have there, not only in terms of the relationships that they have, but the hardware that they've built, and in many cases now, the operating software, the relationships that they built there are not going to be outmatched by Western policymakers or European policymakers.
Thanks for the good picture, Anas. But yeah, I agree. Agility is definitely an element that gives the Russians a huge advantage in that area specifically. Anna, I'm coming back to you now, and both you and Mohanad have mentioned the bases, the Russian bases in Syria. Also, Anas has mentioned the bases that Russia uses in Libya. And as rebels, gained ground in late 2024, and Russia's positions were lost, suffered setbacks. Many observers speculated that Moscow might be forced to abandon its military footprint in the country altogether, and that hasn't quite happened yet, at least. Rather, as you mentioned, Russia's negotiating a deal to keep control over those bases. How has Moscow's military presence evolved in the country since December, and how do you think sustainable are these key installations that the Russians have in the country? Bottom line, will they keep them or not? Anna, please.
So, well, I suspect, again, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think there's a high chance that Russia will get to keep their bases in a far more scaled back capacity than they had under Assad. But I think they will get to keep them. And you can already see this playing out with recent events in the last several weeks, where the Russian government has highlighted that many people had taken refuge in Khmeimim, that Russia had provided that protection for them. And I think that's quite illustrative of how Russia is trying to position itself. But moreover, and here I want to, I want to tie my answer a little bit more to what Anas has just said. This is about how Russia approaches the region overall. And in this regard, let me just say, in a way, Syria was an exception. And here's what I mean. I think both Anas and Mohanad had mentioned that Russia is trying to position itself as a mediator. This approach of positioning Russia as a mediator is really the hallmark of Putin's approach to the region. This is how Putin approached the Middle East, frankly, even before the 2015 intervention in Syria. This is very much a consistent approach that Putin has pursued really since the beginning, since coming to power. He didn't come up with this. Somebody else in the Russian government had put that idea in place in the 1990s. So there's a very long history of what Russia is trying to do and how Russia is approaching this region. And to Anas's point, it is not just about being wedded to one individual person. Really throughout the Middle East overall, again, even before 2015, what Putin had tried to do and really had succeeded in doing was building contacts with all major actors in the region. And broadly speaking, that included both governments and major opposition to them. And of course, Russia periodically positioned itself and signaled that it could be a mediator. And Syria was, in a way, an exception to this because they really did, the Russians really did become wedded to Assad. But I want to stress that that's also not the full story either. There's a little bit more to it. It's just that they certainly built ties with other actors on the ground as well. And I think we see that playing out in Syria right now. So that is, there's my way of answering your question of will Russia get to keep its bases? Again, I think yes, in a more scaled way, partly because they have these relationships and they're continuously working to build these relationships. They're working on building ties with the new government. Look at how quickly Russian propaganda machine turned around in the blink of an eye in one day, from calling all Assad opposition as terrorists to switching completely and saying that they're now that they've changed, that these are people that we can work with. That there's been the message was really just recalibrated in the blink of an eye, that these were no longer terrorists. And that shows you a lot about how the Russian state's flexibility in how it approaches engagement, not only with this region, but frankly, but its narratives overall. And these narratives are completely contradictory, but nobody stops long enough, except for, of course, analysts, to really think and analyze, which is why Russia often gets away with it. But the other piece of the story is that the current government in Damascus is also, from a purely pragmatic standpoint, has an interest in maintaining ties with Russia. Certainly, Ashar himself even said that Russia, from his perspective, is a strategically important country for Syria. There are things Russia can offer to the current regime, and again, this is from purely very pragmatic, very interest-based cost-benefit calculus. There are many reasons why they want to maintain, at the very least, a cordial relationship with Russia. But also, if I may take your question, Chiara, a little bit further and expand beyond bases, because as I mentioned earlier in my remarks, of course, Russia's bases, military bases, are very important. This is the only Russian military outpost outside the former Soviet Union. So, of course, these bases are important. They help Russia project power in multiple directions into NATO's southern flank, into all of Southern Europe, but also into North Africa, deeper into Africa beyond the north. But I want to stress that other types of Russian engagement within the region with Syria is also important, and that has to do with Russia's commercial presence. Mohammed had mentioned Russia shipping oil to Syria. This is very well known. It's been tracked, and the fact that Russia's been able to do this very quickly highlights once again, both leverage that Russia has and also interest in Damascus, no matter who is in charge in Damascus, for building good relations with the Russian state. I would even broaden this beyond oil and simply look further. And as we look into the future of what Russian presence is going to look like, I want to highlight the importance of Russia's commercial presence overall. Certainly, energy is one important aspect of it, but think even beyond that. And also think about the long history that Syria has with Russian military or Soviet military hardware. So weaning itself off of that in a very difficult situation at a time when the Syrian state has really no infrastructure to think of, no real economy, at a time when the government needs to deliver basic goods and services to its people. Whoever is first is going to score a win. And Russians are very good at being first because they don't have a big government bureaucracy behind them. The West has taken a more cautious approach with very good reasons. But I want to stress that if the West does not try to engage more, if the West doesn't try to create more incentives for Damascus to work with Russia, that Russia is going to continue to not only to retain a presence, but also to thwart Western influence. Again, keep in mind the bigger picture here, and that is that it's not simply shipping oil for oil's sake. It's not about keeping bases to have bases. This is about a bigger geopolitical game of standing up to the United States and the West at large, about creating a different world order. And Syria is a small but an important piece of that bigger game that Russia is playing.
Thank you so much, Anna. Really, and so agility, adaptability to change, this capacity that Russia has to always reinvent itself. And somehow, again, your remarks helped me to link to the next question from Mohanad. So Anna was mentioning this really distinctive feature of Russia's engagement in the Middle East and North Africa, which is its ability to speak to virtually every actor involved in the Middle East dynamics, conflicts, and whatever. So from Hezbollah to Haftar, over the past years, Russia has really cultivated ties with the most wide and varied array of regional actors. How have these relationships evolved or shifted or changed in the wake of Assad's fall and Russia's recalibration of its presence in the region? Please, Mohanad.
Yeah, I mean the Iranian Russian relations have we're seen strategic. I mean, there's this strategic cooperation agreement that we've seen between Iran and China, and also Iran and Russia in another form, and there's this Iranian thinking about the Russian role in undermining Tehran's influence across the region. And the next phase, given the the closeness of the Trump regime, I mean, we can say the Trump regime these days, can't we? And the Putin regime in Russia. So these two have closer relations, and Iran is seen as an adversary. There's some sort of an existential reality here in which Iran sees itself facing, do either a deal with Trump or in a strike that could lead to weakening and undermining the whole regime and perhaps its own future. So there's this thinking that I think also applies to the reality in Syria. And we haven't seen, I mean, we've seen it in conspiracy theories about, the Sahel uprising and all of that, and in the sense that there's an Iranian-Russian approach, which basically, could see cooperation between both sides in Syria. We haven't really seen that. Quite to the contrary, I think the Russians were very quick to shift gear in Syria, actually quicker than Iran's regime in that sense. And they opened up. We saw nearly 10 days, I think, after the fall of the Assad regime, the Chechen leader Kadyrov made a statement saying, we extend a hand to the Sharia regime, and we're asking the Moscow to lift the HTS group from the terrorism list, the list of terrorist groups in Russia. Actually, we might see HTS being lifted from that quicker than lifting HTS from the same list at the UN or any other place. There's Russia's, and I think that has to do with how Russia views Syria, and the fact that this Muslim link. The Russian Federation has 6-7 Muslim states, and it looks at the growth of political Islam in a place like Syria with lots of worry, and they would like to help shape the regime in Syria, and if they can. And I think they share the same worry that the Chinese side has when it comes to the Uyghur fighters in Syria, which we are now learning that there are something in between 5,000 to 6,000. There are Chechen fighters in Syria, but I think they're easier to handle with HTS than the Uyghur issue and the Uyghur fighters within the Turkestani fighters within Syria. So what we will see in the next phase is that the Russian authorities continuing their transactional deals with the new Syrian regime, using their relationship with the Gulf to approach the HTS led regime, and also using their role as a mediator. As the geopolitics of the regions are being shaped, the US is intending to withdraw from northeast Syria. The Iran wants to preserve certain positioning when it comes to the minorities in Syria. They're also presenting themselves as protectors of minorities. Actually, the fact that you have about nearly 10,000 refugees at these bases gives them more strategic importance. I mean, Russia is now saying that we are kind of guarantor of some minority rights within Syria. So that they want to play that role. They presented themselves as the Russian intervention in Syria in 2015 began as protectors of minorities, and we saw lots of imagery there with Orthodox priests and so forth. I think they would like to replicate that in another form, and this is all preparing the ground for what comes later. In in relation to their positioning vis-a-vis Turkey and Israel, the tensions there, vis-a-vis the US withdrawal from northeastern Syria. They played a peace role in northeastern Syria, and they were able to preserve that role. And I tell you something else, even in southern Syria, Russia was playing a kind of a mediator role between the regime and southern Syrian rebels that they seek now to replicate with HTS. And they're discussing this with the new regime and trying to play that role in southern Syria. But this requires, of course, more resources and more troops on the ground. I'm not sure, how will they do with that? I'm not sure they can use North Korean soldiers in Syria to, as representing Russian interests there. But this definitely shows you the interest in staying in Syria in the long term, preserving these bases and trying to find a role for Russia to play. And I'll just repeat what Anne said previously on the relationship between the Syrian regime and the Russians before the Russian side, before the downfall of the regime. Since 2017-18, we were seeing lots of criticism coming out of Moscow against the Syrian regime and its inflexibility in dealing with the big shifts and big changes that were happening regionally. And I think they wanted a different approach. They wanted the Syrian regime to give up quicker on Iran and Syria. And I don't see them entirely unhappy with Iran's absence from the Syrian arena. I think now they see more spaces to move in between the various actors regionally, which are trying to position themselves in Syria. Sorry, I think I spoke a little bit longer than expected.
No worries, Mohanad. I didn't interrupt because that was very interesting. Thank you. But yes, now we should go quickly to Anas in a few minutes. Do you think, Anas, so based on what we discussed so far, can we define this shift in Russia's approach, especially for what regards North Africa? Are we seeing a shift from maybe an expansion strategy to more of a consolidation strategy? And I think, for example, of Libya, of course. Do you see, Moscow focusing on holding onto key assets like former Wagner, Africa Corps affiliated networks in Libya, rather than pursuing new footholds, new paths, new adventures, let's say?
It's a great question. As I said in the previous question, it's only new for us because of the bandwidth, right? These are relationships that they have been building and cultivating over years, and evolutions that have been going on for even longer, right? So I want to just pick up on one point that you made before, because it links to this question, right? When we think of Russia, when we think of Russia's presence in Syria, we think of it in terms of the big bad guys, the monsters that go bump in the night. They're fighting Islamists. They're working with Iran. They're working with Hezbollah. This is an area where there is, not really working with Western allies and partners. But the irony is pretty brutal in Libya, because Russia gained influence in Libya not by defying the West, but by embedding itself in the West's own coalition, right? So it's not like a hostile takeover, because they're working with Egypt, they're working with the UAE, and they're working with Haftar as an American, right? So this is why it's so hard to stop, because everyone's in it, right? Without the Emirati money, Haftar and Wagner wouldn't have been paid for the last couple of years. Without Egypt, Haftar wouldn't have been able to get any of his weapons in. Russia wouldn't have been able to use its airspace, and the US wouldn't have been able to host its diplomatic talks. So there's really kind of an irony there, because these are the countries that didn't just let Russia in; they opened up the back door and rolled out the red carpet, and that's been happening now for several years. When it comes to what Wagner is doing, I think I would characterize it not really as just expansion or consolidation. It's gone past consolidation. They're crystallizing these relationships, because they've evolved from just being these, dependent outposts across the continent and the Mediterranean to being a strategic network of interdependency. Each one of those allies, it's almost like, all for one and one for all, right? They all have to work together to get to a shared objective. Libya is interesting, but Sudan is also critical for this. Wagner has not just moved and this is a great example of its evolution and Russia's thinking. Wagner has gone from being, this outlier and plausible, implausible deniability to institutionalizing its relationships. Libya is the first case study because they've gone from saying, "Hey, we don't know anything about those guys that are running around in Libya," to integrating them and trying to institutionalizing them. They work with the Tariq bin Ziyad brigade, Haftar's own Praetorian Guard, led by one of his sons. They've got joint command forces. They've integrated themselves into the communication networks of these brigades. They need them to fight. They need them to live and breathe, right? When you move more into Libya's economy and Sudan's economy, we know things like they've been shipping out gold for several years now, billions of dollars of gold that get deposited in Abu Dhabi, that clear Libyan customs. That's just one element. I mean, many countries smuggle licitly and illicitly, right? But when it comes to Libya, they've just broken the mold, right? They're not using gold and dollars to fund their war expeditions in Libya and to furnish their outlay in this massive network that they've been building over the last 6 years. They have broken the mold of what we think in terms of economic warfare because they've printed Libya's currency, right? They've counterfeited Libya's currency and injected it within the central bank. It's a priceless tactic because Libyans like myself and others that are in Libya are paying for it with inflation, right? So it's the best strategy of all. And because Russia is doing it, there has been no pushback because other Western partners are helping in that arena. It's kind of like, well, we're not really sure what to do. I think when we move more from the physical and the economic footprint, you just see that Russia is doing something that is quite novel. It's creating these synergies between what we'd have previously discussed, at least in ourselves in a Western-centric or Eurocentric kind of view of lines in the maps. But they've created synergies and corridors that don't line up that way, right? When they build bases in Mat and Asada, when they're building bases with their partners like the UAE and Amrajas in Chad, when they're working with the RSF in Sudan, when they're working with the junta in Mali, right? And they connect these dots through areas in southern Libya that just don't register on the map of European policymakers unless they're thinking of migration. What they're building is webs of synergies, right? Because these are also corridors where they traffic humans, traffic gold, smuggle in weapons. This is outside of how we conventionally look at these zones and these theaters, and we're just a little bit outdated. So I wouldn't say it's just, it's consolidating. They've crystallized it, right? And I think that's where we need to really understand the evolution of, Wagner, is that these guys are not, they're not just with a fresh coat of paint. These guys have diplomatic plates now, right? It's going to be very difficult to work against them in the way that we could have several years ago. When they establish bases, it's just one part of the puzzle. They're weaving these dots and creating webs, whilst we still think in terms of lines in the sand and trying to draw those parallels in terms of understanding sovereignty. Those actors have given away their sovereignty in exchange for regime security because of all the points that I made earlier on. Libya exposes all of this fundamental asymmetry because Europe is throwing money at all of these symptoms, right? At migration symptoms, at instability on the northern coast. But Russia is investing in the disease itself, right? And they don't need to solve the problems. They just need to make sure that they can threaten those problems to the West and use this whole, what we're calling at the beginning of this, a new theater. They're just rebranding it now for a West that will sooner or later, I sense, will try to either downplay or inoculate how much Ukraine is consuming their bandwidth, because eastern flank over here, southern flank over here, there's a massive buildup, and the West is nowhere in sight. I mean, that's really where we can distinguish, not only in terms of bandwidth, but just in terms of how we look at this. There's a level of comfort that Russia has with all of the contradictions that Mohanad and Anna have painted, right? They don't mind speaking to all different actors. They don't mind painting themselves, as siding with one actor like Assad today and then shifting on the other side. But within all of those shifts, there's contradictions. The very same networks that you're discussing, Anna, I'm looking at the Libya network of their own disinformation networks, where they are still calling Ahmed al-Shara, they're still calling him Jalani and still calling him an Al-Qaeda asset, right? So they're perfectly happy with this yin and yang. I can be my worst, I can be my best, I can be your enemy, I can be your friend. The West doesn't think of that, and it's still not comfortable with its own contradiction. So they're just regretfully kind of light years ahead in terms of strategic thinking, and they've outpaced the West and other Arab states in their thinking.
Thank you very much, Anas. I would have a lot of follow-up questions, but unfortunately our time is over. So I hope to continue the discussion with the three of you anytime soon, in a way or another. Thank you very much for your insights and precious knowledge about Russia, about the countries of the Middle East and North Africa. It was a pleasure for me to talk to you. And thank you, Anna Borshchevskaya. Thank you, Mohanad Hage and Anas Gomati. And as I said, I hope we will continue this in any possible ways. Thank you very much.